They said Clara Whitlow wouldn't survive the winter. Pregnant, alone, and accused of dark things by the people of Dry Creek, they drove her out like a curse they didn't want to carry. She buried her husband with frozen hands and waited for the cold to finish what fear had started. But death didn't come. Instead, a stranger named Elias Kane stepped out of the woods, silent, steady, carrying stories he didn't tell, and scars he didn't hide. This isn't a story about spells or superstition. It's about survival, about what love looks like when there's nothing left to give. It's about one woman, one unborn child, and the quiet strength that refused to disappear. Valora couldn't feel her feet anymore. Her toes had gone numb days ago, the cold creeping slowly up her legs like death itself climbing her spine. Curled in the corner of the abandoned barn, she clutched her swollen belly with one hand and the worn edge of a wool shawl with the other. The child inside her had stopped kicking that morning. She hadn't eaten in 3 days. No, 4. Time blurred. The once prized healer of Belwick was now just another ghost waiting for the snow to swallow her. Her lips were cracked, her hair matted beneath her bonnet, and her hands, once so steady and skilled, trembled uncontrollably as she tried to adjust the torn hem of her dress. There was no fire, no light, only the fading awareness of how far she had fallen. She no longer cried. The tears had frozen into icicles long ago, just like everything else she had cared about. The hunger was no longer sharp but dull and wide, like a rock pressing into her from the inside. She didn't expect to survive the night. A month ago, she and Samuel had stood together in front of their cottage in Belwick, still naively believing truth would matter. They'd come to the door with torches and scripture, screaming about the fever that took 3 children. They said it was her fault, that her herbalism was witchcraft, that the red mark beneath her collarbone was the devil's kiss. She had treated those same children night after night, desperate to save them. But when they died, the whispers turned into roars. Samuel tried to protect her. He stood between her and the mob with his hunting rifle, trembling but firm. They beat him nearly to death. They dragged them both into the town square and offered them a choice: exile or burn. They left that night with only what they could carry. But frost and grief are cruel traveling companions. 2 weeks later, Samuel died in his sleep, his body giving out before his spirit ever did. She buried him beneath frozen dirt with nothing but her bare hands. Since then, she had been here, fighting off death in a barn too cold for mice. She had once been revered. Women brought her their newborns. Men brought her their wounded. She cured coughs with roots and fevers with leaves. But respect, it turned out, was thinner than paper in a town ruled by fear. Her healing had become sorcery overnight. Her remedies rebranded as potions, her touch reimagined. As a curse, they took everything: food, tools, even the leather-bound book of medicine passed down by her grandmother. She hid only one thing: a silver pendant tucked beneath her bodice, the last piece of her life before the hatred. She'd considered trading it in the next town, 15 miles east, but her body no longer had the strength. She knew she wouldn't make it that far. She had tried to light a fire once, but the matches were too damp and her hands too clumsy. Now she simply lay on the moldy hay, her breath shallow, her eyes barely able to track the movement of a mouse that scurried across the rafters. Even that mouse had somewhere warmer to be. She envied it. She dreamed of Samuel often, though she wasn't sure if it was memory or madness. His hands were always warm in her dreams. He would press them to her cheek and whisper that they'd find a new start. But the dream would dissolve like everything else, and she'd wake to the taste of blood on her tongue and cold that made her bones ache. Her belly ached worse. Was the child still alive inside her? She couldn't tell anymore. There was no kick, no flutter, only a heavy silence in her womb that frightened her more than the cold. "I'm sorry," she whispered, not sure if she was speaking to Samuel, the baby, or the universe itself. "I tried." She was so tired. She didn't want to die, but she couldn't imagine a way to keep living. Her heart slowed. Her body curled tighter into itself, instinctively seeking heat where there was none. That's when the door creaked open. It wasn't the town mob. She knew because they never knocked. A shadow blocked the wind for a moment before the door slammed shut again. A large man stepped forward, bundled in thick furs, an axe slung over his shoulder. His beard was wet with melting snow, his eyes unreadable beneath a heavy brow. Valora tried to push herself upright but only managed to raise her head. Her voice cracked as she rasped, "Please, I have nowhere else to go." The man didn't answer immediately. He looked at her, not with fear or disgust, but with something else, recognition. He knelt and opened a bundle from his coat. The smell hit her before her eyes did. Bread, still warm, and a wedge of hard cheese. She blinked, certain she was hallucinating. "Eat," he said gruffly, pushing the food toward her. She reached for it with shaking hands. "Why?" she asked, too weak to form a full sentence. His answer was simple. "Because they burned my mother too." She didn't ask his name. Not yet. She was too busy chewing through tears, trying not to sob between bites. He sat beside her in silence, his massive presence shielding her from the worst of the wind. When she finally looked up, she managed 2 words. "I'm Valora." He gave a slow nod. "Thorley." Just that. No more. But in the way he said it, she heard everything. He had seen what she had seen, lost what she had lost. As he helped her sit upright, she felt something stir inside her. Faint, almost imperceptible. Not hope, not yet, but the memory of it. And as she clutched the bread to her chest and leaned against the barn wall, she knew she had just met the one person in the world who might not see her as a curse. She was still dying, but now, maybe, she wouldn't die alone. Thorley's cabin was smaller than Valora expected, but the warmth that hit her as she stepped inside nearly buckled her knees. After weeks of cold so brutal it had dulled her senses, the heat from the fire felt like being touched by life itself. She sank into a wooden chair near the hearth without, waiting to be invited, too weak and too far past pride to care. The flames danced in the stone hearth, and though her hands still trembled as she held them out to the fire, she no longer feared dying that night. Thorley moved about silently, his large frame surprisingly graceful as he retrieved a bowl and filled it with steaming broth. "It's venison," he said, placing it gently beside her along with a chunk of dark bread. "Eat slowly. If you rush, it'll come back up." She obeyed, sipping with care even though every nerve in her body screamed for more. The taste was simple but real. As she dared to ask the question that had been burning in her chest since the moment he offered her food in that barn. "Why help me?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he settled into the chair across from her, his eyes watching the fire as if it might speak for him. "My mother," he said. Finally. "They burned her too." The words dropped like stones in a well. Valora looked up sharply, her spoon halfway to her mouth. He kept speaking, voice steady but low. She was a healer, grew herbs, helped people. Until one day the mayor's son got sick. They said it was her fault. Called her a witch, dragged her to the square and lit the pyre themselves. He paused. "I was 10. Valora set the bowl down, her stomach turning with a different kind of nausea. The parallels were too sharp. "Your father?" she asked. "Hanged himself 6 months later. Couldn't live with what happened. I ended up in the Coldridge orphanage." He leaned back, the fire casting flickering light over the scar on his hand. "You're not the first they've tried to destroy. You won't be the last." Valora felt something shift deep in her chest. She hadn't heard her story from someone else's mouth before. She hadn't known how badly she needed to. "I tried to save them," she whispered, her voice thick. "Those children. I stayed up for nights with them. I gave them everything I had." Thorley nodded slowly. "I believe you." 3 words, so simple, yet they unraveled something tight and bitter inside her. She hadn't realized how deeply she had doubted herself until someone said they didn't. Later that night, Thorley offered her the bed. "I'll keep watch by the door," he said, already moving a chair into position. Valora protested weakly, but he only shrugged. "You need sleep. You're no good to yourself. Otherwise." The mattress was thin but warm. The blanket smelled of pine and smoke, and her body surrendered to rest almost immediately. She didn't know how long she slept before the pounding began. Not thunder, not wind. Fists on wood. Her eyes flew open. Thorley was already at the door, shotgun in. "And a Blackwood," came the voice from outside. "We know she's in there." Valora's blood ran cold. She recognized that voice, Silas Pewitt, head of Belwick's council. She barely made it out of bed when Thorley turned to her and pointed to the floor. "Root cellar," he said, already moving the rug that hid the trapdoor. "Now." She didn't argue. Her fingers fumbled with the latch before she lowered herself into the darkness. The last thing she saw before the hatch closed was Thorley's massive frame, standing tall with the shotgun aimed at the door. She held her breath, heart pounding so hard she was sure they'd hear it from above. "They tracked her here," a second voice claimed, Abel Wells, the pastor's son. "We followed her footprints." Thorley's reply was calm. "The only tracks out there are mine. And dear." The silence that followed made Valora squeeze her eyes shut. She imagined them breaking. The door down, dragging her out by her hair, forcing her to watch the fire be built again. "You're harboring a witch," Silas snapped. "We have every right to search." Thorley's voice turned cold. "This is my land. That makes it my fight." A pause, then the unmistakable click of the shotgun being cocked. "You take another step and I decide my dinner needs meat." Valora could hear the hesitation in their boots above, the shift in tone. "We'll come back," Pewitt warned. "With the sheriff." Thorley didn't answer. Just silence. Then footsteps retreating, hooves crunching snow, the creak of saddles. The moment stretched long and tense before the trapdoor finally opened, and Thorley's hand reached down. "They're gone," he said simply. Valora's legs trembled as she climbed back into the cabin. The warmth felt thinner now, as if danger had leaked through the cracks in the wall. She sank into the chair, wrapping her arms around herself, shaken. "They'll come back," she whispered. "They always do." Thorley placed the shotgun back against the wall, his shoulders tight. "Not tonight," he said, glancing out the small window. "Storm's picking up again." The snow had returned, thicker now, thicker, hiding tracks and swallowing sound. They had until morning, maybe. Valora looked at the fire. The same hands that had once built cradles in Belwick were now setting tripwires and hiding weapons. She wasn't sure what frightened her more, the men who had come, or the fact that someone was finally willing to fight for her. Thorley pulled a chair next to hers, sitting without a word. Outside, the storm howled. Inside, two people waited, one haunted by what she'd lost, the other ready to protect her no matter the cost. They left before first light. Thorley packed only what they needed: food, blankets, his axe, a pouch of dried herbs, and the rusted pendant Valora had hidden under her dress. The cabin, once a refuge, now felt like a trap waiting to spring shut. Valora didn't ask where they were going, only if they would reach it before the snow became impassable. "If we keep moving, yes," Thorley said, helping her tighten the borrowed coat around her shoulders. Her belly was heavier now. She felt the weight not just in her body, but in every decision they made. They walked in silence at first, the crunch of boots in frozen ground the only sound between them. Thorley led through narrow animal trails, weaving through pine and birch, away from the paths horses or men would take. Valora kept pace despite her weakened state, her will stronger than her breath. Each step away from the cabin was a step further from death, or at least from the version of death that waited for her back in Belwick. It wasn't until they paused to drink from a stream hidden beneath a crust of ice that Thorley told her where they were going. "My grandmother still lives," he said, "north of here. Her people call themselves the Abnaki. If we can reach her, you'll be safe. They don't burn healers where she is." Valora blinked. "You're Abnaki?" He gave a slow nod. "On my mother's side. My father was French. A trapper." His voice turned quieter. "They called her a witch, too. Not in her village, but once she moved near. Coldridge with my father it started." Valora understood more than he needed to say. Knowledge passed from women, especially knowledge about herbs and illness, had always been feared. "She's still alive. Strong as an oak," he said. "But if she accepts you, the rest will follow." Valora didn't ask. What would happen if she didn't? She knew the answer already. They would keep moving until her legs gave out or her womb forced her to stop. Either way, she would not return to Belwick. The forest thickened as they traveled. There were no more trails, only instinct. Thorley read the land like a map. Only he could see, pausing now and then to listen or adjust their path. Once, when he stopped suddenly, Valora reached for her belly, fearing he sensed danger, but it was only a shift in wind. They saw no one, heard no one, but paranoia walked beside them like a third shadow. At night, they slept, curled beneath rocks or buried in blankets under low trees, never building a fire. Valora's hands were cracked and raw, but she didn't complain. She had nothing left to lose. Thorley made snares when they rested, bringing back rabbits or a grouse, which they ate cold to avoid smoke. Her body ached, constantly, but she never asked to stop. The child hadn't moved much in the last 2 days. That scared her more than the threat of men with ropes. On the fourth night, a silent figure appeared in the darkness, standing just outside the perimeter of their camp. Valora's first instinct was to reach for Thorley, but he was already awake, rifle raised but lowered again when the figure stepped closer and spoke in a language she didn't understand. Words rolled like water, soft and rhythmic. Another figure appeared, then another. Hunters, dressed in furs and paint. Thorley responded in the same language, his voice steady, low. After a tense exchange, the lead figure turned his gaze to Valora. His eyes did not show contempt or fear, only deep scrutiny. After a moment, he nodded once, gesturing eastward. Thorley turned to her. "They'll take us. They've sent word ahead." Valora exhaled for the first time in what felt like hours. They were being allowed to pass, but not yet accepted. That judgment still lay ahead. The journey to the Abnaki winter camp took less than an hour, but it felt like crossing into another world. The trees opened into a protected hollow dotted with dome-shaped lodges, covered in bark and hides. Smoke rose from the roofs in lazy spirals, and faint murmurs came from within. Children peered from doorways, their eyes wide and curious. No one shouted. No one pointed. Valora clutched Thorley's hand as they passed between the dwellings, feeling the heat of the stairs, but not the hatred she had come to expect. Then the crowd parted, and a tall elderly woman stepped forward. Her face was etched with age, but her posture was unbent, her eyes bright. She stared at Thorley for a long time before reaching up to touch his cheek. A word passed between them. One Valora recognized even before Thorley translated it. Grandmother. The woman turned to Valora then, and her gaze pierced through flesh and bone. She spoke a single sentence, then looked back at Thorley. "She asks what burden you carry," Thorley said. "She sees shadow in your eyes." Valora's throat tightened. She could barely speak, but she managed. "Tell her I've only tried to help, but they called it evil." Thorley translated, and the woman's reaction was unexpected. She laughed. Not mockery, joy, relief. She stepped aside and pointed to a nearby lodge. "She says you will stay in her home tonight," Thorley said, almost smiling. "Tomorrow she will decide if your heart is true." Valora felt her knees go weak. For the first time since the night they were exiled, she felt something unfamiliar swell in her chest. Not safety, not forgiveness. Something simpler. Something that still held the promise of life, hope. News traveled faster than Valora expected. It started with a single mother, her child weak with fever and no coin to spare. She came with nothing but hope, and left with her daughter breathing easier. Then came a hunter with an infected wound, then twins with a terrible cough, then a woman swollen, with pregnancy and fear. Word spread that a healer lived near the forest's edge, one who did not ask for silver or names, only patience and truth. Valora's hands remembered their old rhythm, even if her heart was slower to trust itself again. She brewed teas from pine and willow bark, crushed herbs, for poultices, and whispered comfort in the quiet way her grandmother once had. She did not advertise. She didn't need to. The people came because they were desperate. She helped them because she remembered what it felt like to be left behind. Each time she guided a patient through pain, something within her began to stitch itself back together. Thorley watched her without interfering. He built shelves for her jars, reinforced the roof, cleared space for firewood, but he never told her what to do. He let her reclaim her purpose in her own way. At night, they sat close by the fire, sharing silence and occasional stories. She learned how he carved his own spoons as a boy, how he once saved a fox cub from drowning, He learned how she used to sing to Samuel while grinding herbs. They didn't speak of love, not directly, but when she placed her hand over his after a long day tending to a woman in labor, he didn't move it away. When she asked if he could build a second structure for patients, he started clearing land the next morning without a word. Within weeks, the new building took shape. A small healing house, not much more than one room with a bed and a wide window. But it was enough. Valora filled it with what she had. Dried plants, salves, linens stitched from old garments. Her healing room was not a witch's den or a doctor's office. It was something born of both, shaped by survival and care. It was Thorley who called it a beginning first. "You've made something new." "Here," he said one evening as she strained tincture into glass bottles. Out of nothing. She didn't know how to answer that. All she had done was return to what she had once been, before Belwick, before the fire and the exile. But maybe the act of reclaiming what was stolen was, in itself, a kind of creation. She found herself watching him differently now. The way he cut lumber, how his eyes narrowed when focusing, how he always made enough stew for 2 extra mouths, just in case someone showed up late. There was a softness beneath his gruffness, and she began to understand that he had been healing too. Not from fever or injury, but from years of quiet loneliness. Sometimes he would place a hand on her back as he passed behind her in the doorway. Once she found herself resting her head on his shoulder, without even realizing she'd done it. There was no declaration between them, no need for one. Something was building, slowly but certainly, with roots deep and quiet. One day, as she was preparing a compress for a man's aching joints, she noticed a rider approaching through the tree line. Her hands stilled. It was not fear this time, but caution. The man dismounted and walked slowly toward the house. She recognized him long before he reached the door. Pastor Webb. He looked thinner, older, like someone who hadn't slept well in weeks. He removed his hat before he spoke. "Miss Finch," he began. His voice cracked. "I've come to ask forgiveness." She didn't invite him in, but she didn't send him away either. He stood in the doorway while she returned to her work, speaking without looking at him. "What you allowed nearly killed me, killed my husband." He bowed his head. "I know, and I won't insult you by asking you to forget it. But the town, the council, we see now how wrong we were." "I see it." His eyes met hers. "They sent me to ask if you would return, to take back your home, to become Belwick's healer again." Valora paused. Her fingers pressed gently into the cloth she was folding. She thought of the house she had once loved, of the garden Samuel had planted, of the book of recipes stolen from her shelf. She thought of the people who now lived in her memories and no longer in her heart. "No," she said simply. "I won't return." The silence stretched until Pastor Webb gave a slow nod. "I understand." He turned to leave, but she stopped him with a question. "What are they willing to give?" He looked back. "Supplies," he answered. "Lumber, tools, medicine jars, linen. Whatever you need to continue your work, here." For the first time in their conversation, Valora looked directly at him. "Then I'll accept that. But not for me, for the people who—" "Come to my door." Pastor Webb nodded. "I'll see that it's delivered." He turned and walked back toward his horse, shoulders heavy. Valora stood at the threshold of her healing house, watching him go, her face unreadable. Thorley joined her a moment later, carrying a stack of kindling. "Friend of yours?" he asked. She shook her head. "Not anymore." She glanced at the healing house, then at the cabin, then down at her belly, which was now round and unmistakably full of life. "But maybe this is enough. Maybe what we're building here matters more than what we lost." Thorley didn't answer right. Away. He simply placed the kindling beside the fire pit and reached for her hand. "Then let's build it right," he said. As they stood together, her hand in his and the healing house behind them, Valora felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Peace that wasn't borrowed or fragile. It was rooted. It was. Now. She had refused the past. She had chosen what came next, and what came next was hers to shape. The clinic grew faster than Valora had imagined. What had started as a single-room healing space beside the cabin had become a trusted place for the sick and injured across multiple settlements. Word of her knowledge spread beyond the forest trails, reaching even the physicians in Capital City. At tea. First, they arrived with skepticism, curious to see the witch healer with no formal training. But her results spoke louder than titles. She treated wounds they couldn't close, eased fevers they couldn't name, and recognized patterns and symptoms before anyone else did. One of the visiting doctors stayed longer than expected, eventually asking if he could send a medical student to learn under her. Valora agreed, not out of pride, but because she knew the work mattered more than who was doing it. Soon apprentices rotated through her clinic, taking notes and asking questions, learning to respect not just the remedies she used, but the care with which she applied them. She was no longer merely surviving. She had become a teacher, a guide, a voice once silenced, now heard even in distant towns. It was during the height of summer that the sickness began. At first, it was just one child, burning with fever and unable to eat. Then another, then 5 more. The symptoms were strange. Rapid weight loss, trembling, hallucinations. No one could trace the source. Valora suspected the water, but tests were slow, and the sick kept coming. She barely slept, working by firelight and herbal fumes. Thorley supported her as he always did, preparing meals, gathering supplies, calming frightened families. Then one morning, she found him slumped near the garden, too weak to stand. His skin was burning. His eyes couldn't focus. Panic gripped her so suddenly it took her breath away. She carried him to their bed and tried not to cry as she placed a cool cloth on his forehead. "Don't you dare," she whispered. "Don't you leave me." Every hour that passed felt like a punishment, a test of faith. She tried everything, compresses, teas, tinctures, but the fever didn't break. For 7 days, Valora barely left his side. The baby kicked in her womb as if reminding her that life still clung to her body even as death hovered nearby. She spoke to Thorley constantly, whether he responded or not. She told him about the people he'd helped, the children who still laughed because he'd built their mothers a safe place to heal. She told him how lost she'd been when he found her, and how afraid she was now to lose him. On the 8th day, she was washing his face with lavender water when he finally opened his eyes. "I'm thirsty," he whispered. She nearly collapsed, sobbing into his chest with relief so overwhelming it numbed her. He was thin, weak, and pale, but alive. Alive. She helped him sit up slowly, holding the cup to his lips, then holding him like the air itself might steal him away again. For the first time in over a week, the shadows that had gathered in her chest began to retreat. Thorley had survived, and so had she. As soon as he could walk again, they began preparing to leave for Belwick. Word had come that the town was struggling under the same illness, with dozens sick and no one able to explain the cause. A formal request had arrived, asking if Valora would come. Not demanding, not assuming, asking. It was the first time anyone from Belwick had spoken her name without accusation. She packed the remedies, Thorley packed the tools, and together they returned to the place that had once tried to erase her. The wagon rolled slowly into town, and the silence was deafening. People watched from windows, unsure whether to approach or hide. She walked straight to the old town hall, which now served as an emergency shelter. Inside, rows of sick lined the floor. Some cried out, others barely breathed. Without hesitation, she knelt beside a child and took his hand. "I'm here," she whispered. "We'll start now." The work was brutal. Long hours, endless needs, too little time. But the townspeople who had once turned their backs now followed her instructions. They boiled water. They fetched clean linens. They held their own children as Valora applied her remedies. Even Pastor Webb arrived to help, carrying buckets and offering prayers, but never questioning her process. It was clear now to all of them. The woman they'd feared was the one saving them. Thorley worked alongside her, still pale but steady, as they moved from patient to patient. When the fevers began to break, the mood in town shifted. The gratitude wasn't loud. It was humbling. Former enemies bowed their heads in silence. Some wept. Others left small offerings outside the door: eggs, bread, candles. No one said "witch" again, only "thank you." When the worst had passed, Valora stood in the center of town with Thorley at her side, her belly full with the child he'd nearly never met. The mayor, flanked by council members, stepped forward to speak. "We wronged you," he said simply. "There is no making it right, but we hope you'll allow us to try." She didn't answer with words. Instead, she turned to tend to one last child in line, wiping a fevered brow with hands that no longer trembled. Behind her, Thorley smiled, quiet, proud, whole again. Justice hadn't come with fire or vengeance. It had come with healing, and this time, it would stay. Valora stood just outside the town hall in Belwick, watching the sun rise over the place that had once cast her out. The mayor's words from the day before still echoed in her mind, a formal offer to return, to reclaim her house, her land, her name. But she had already made her decision. She thanked them for the apology and declined the invitation. There was no home left for her in Belwick, only memories, most of them soaked in grief. What she did accept was their offer of reparations, not in gold or land, but in supplies: lumber, medicine jars, linens, dried herbs, and construction materials. With that, she would build something far more enduring than a return to the past. She would build a regional clinic, one that served everyone, from Belwick to the outlying villages, regardless of where they came from or what they believed. Justice wasn't vengeance. It was creating something that outlived the pain. "We start tomorrow," she told Thorley as they rode back toward the forest. "Not just for us, for all of them." The materials arrived in waves. Wagons rolled in carrying beams, tools, glass panes, and books from the city. People came too, not only the sick, but those who wanted to help. Women offered food to the builders. Men volunteered their labor. And one day, a young man stepped off a cart holding a letter from the university hospital. His name was Edward. He had studied anatomy and theory, but he wanted to learn what no book could teach: how Valora treated people, not just symptoms. She hesitated at first, unsure whether she could be a teacher, but Edward watched and listened more than he spoke, and slowly, she let him in. He asked about every herb, every tea, every choice she made. More students followed. They came expecting to learn medicine and left, understanding healing. And with each passing month, the clinic grew, not just in size, but in purpose. Her fame spread beyond the counties. Letters arrived from places she had never seen, towns plagued by strange illnesses, isolated villages desperate for guidance. Valora answered them all. She wrote notes in careful script, packed bundles of herbs, and trained her apprentices with the same quiet rigor her grandmother once had. People still whispered about the woman in the woods, but the word witch had been replaced by healer, wise woman, even doctor, though she had no formal title. The pain of her past didn't disappear, but it transformed. The grief became understanding. The betrayal became clarity. She no longer ran from what had been done to her. She used it. Every injustice became a lesson, every scar a map. She taught the students not just how to heal a body, but how to read a person's fear, how to listen when someone said nothing, how to see the difference between sickness and sorrow. She had become more than what they tried to destroy. One evening, while cleaning the shelves after a long day, she found Thorley watching her from the doorway. His hands were rough from chopping wood, his beard flecked with sawdust, and yet there was something boyish in the way he looked at her. She set the jar down and crossed the room to him. He took her hand gently. "Marry me," he said. No speech, no ring, no ceremony planned. Just the words, just the truth. Her eyes filled with tears as she nodded. Yes. They married beneath the same tree where Samuel had once carved their initials into a piece of pine. There was no crowd, no church, just the two of them, a few friends, and the quiet knowledge that they had already lived through vows far stronger than anything words could capture. That night they returned to the cabin, the same one she'd first stepped into, half frozen and hopeless. But now it was theirs, in every way. No longer a place of hiding, a home. The healing center expanded again after the wedding. New rooms were added, one for childbirth, one for long-term care, and a separate herb garden maintained by students under Valora's guidance. She no longer worked alone. Edward managed appointments. The apprentices prepared treatments. Thorley built furniture for patients too weak to stand. Everything had changed, but the heart of it remained the same. People still arrived with fear and left with hope. And Valora still knew every patient's name, every child's cough, every story etched in every scar. On the door of the new main entrance, she hung a hand-carved sign. It read, "Finch Healing House. All are welcome." One afternoon, a young girl, Eliza, daughter of Silas Pewitt, came with headaches no one else could explain. Valora treated her gently. When Eliza asked why, after everything her father had done, Valora smiled. "Because healing isn't just about bodies," she said. "Sometimes it's about what lives between us." Eliza asked if that was magic. Valora touched her hand and replied, "No, child, that's just being human." In the quiet of early morning, Valora stood on the porch, one hand resting on her now husband's arm, the other on her swollen belly. A child was coming, a new generation, a future she had once believed she'd never live. To see, she watched the apprentices sweep the clinic floor, heard Edward laughing with a patient, felt Thorley squeeze her hand without needing to say a word. For the first time, she believed this peace might last. What they'd built together couldn't be burned or chased away. It was stronger than fear, stronger than exile, stronger than death. A mother, a healer, a teacher, a wife. She had been called many things, but the truth was simple and absolute. This wasn't witchcraft. This wasn't dark magic. This was love, and it was enough. If this story touched your heart, don't keep it to yourself. Leave a like, tell us in the comments what you felt, and share it with someone who would be moved by this journey. And of course, subscribe to Souls of the Old West for more true-hearted stories like this one.